What's up guys, Nick here, and today I'm going to be doing a 10-month review of the Canon 10-18 EFS lens. Let's get into it. To kind of talk about the specifics of this lens, what I like, what I dislike, the actual image it produces, the build quality, the aperture, and the focusing motors that this lens has. So starting off with the build quality. The lens isn't really built the best. I mean, it is a $279 lens. It's built entirely out of plastic, but this is Canon's budget wide-angle lens. I mean, they have the 10 to 22 millimeter, which is about twice the cost. It's older, but it's a higher end lens. It has better glass in it. It's built better, but that lens doesn't have image stabilization, but we'll get to that in a second. But this lens does feel identical to the 18 to 55. It's just slightly bigger, and the zoom ring is that same rubber they use as well. It's very quick and easy to go from 10 to 18 millimeters, just a little bit of a twist and you're popping between the two. The back part that actually mounts to the camera is entirely plastic. There's no metal anywhere. Now the front element of the lens does stick out quite a bit. I mean, that's because of its focal length, but you can still put filters on there. As a matter of fact, that entire sequence was filmed with an ND filter on that lens. Although the lens is made entirely out of plastic, it does feel relatively durable. Like, it could survive maybe one or two falls. There's not that many moving parts on it, and since it is more of a cheap lens, if something happens to it, it's not going to be as big of a deal as opposed to if something happens to like this Sigma 18 to 35. And as I hinted at before, one very nice feature of this lens is the image stabilization that's built into it. This is already a very wide lens, so it doesn't take much to keep it stable, but just having that extra layer of image stabilization just helps smooth out the footage overall, because most Canon APS-C cameras don't have any sort of stabilization built into the body. Now, to talk about focusing motors, does have Canon's STM focusing motor, so it's very quiet. It makes little to no noise at all, and it's very smooth when it finds its focus. Now, the manual focus ring on it is very tiny, so if you are someone that likes manual focus, you're gonna run into some problems with the tiny travel and the tiny ring. It can be done, but nowadays autofocus is so good that you don't really need manual focus. I mean, granted, there is still a time and a place for when you use manual focus as opposed to autofocus, but the autofocus works great. That STM motor pairs fantastic with Canon's dual pixel autofocus, so when you select something for it to track it, it'll lock the focus on there and it'll keep whatever you're tracking in focus without a problem. Now, you can get pretty close to your subject, specifically according to the internet 8.4 inches, which for a wide angle lens is pretty good, so this lens will do a respectable job at close-ups. Now to move on to the aperture, it only has an f4.5, and that's at its widest. When you zoom in to 18 millimeters, it drops down to a 5.6, so it won't give you the best of depth of field, especially at 10 millimeters. You're not getting any depth of field with that small aperture. When you zoom in to 18, you'll get some because it's more compressed, and yes, when you focus on something very close, it'll look good. I mean, it has 7 aperture blades, so all the background blur will have a nice organic feel, so it won't be a bunch of weird shapes. The Sigma 18 to 35 actually has 9 aperture blades, so this lens isn't really far behind it, but since that aperture is very small, the low light performance is not really good at all. You really have to crank up your camera's ISO, which introduces grain into your image, so if you're looking to do low light shooting with this lens, it's not really doable if you want to get a clean image. Now to move on to the part that I think really matters, that is the image the lens produces. How good can it make your footage look? Now, the image is good. It's not perfect. It's nothing spectacular like the Sigma lens. It's not as sharp as like a nice piece of glass, but it's also not bad. It is sharp enough for basic YouTube content because the video will go through so much compression, you really won't be able to tell the difference. And this sharpness can be seen in close-up shots. For example, this one here, you can see all the little hairs on Lewis's face. So it is a relatively sharp lens, but in certain cases, it does become evident that this isn't an expensive lens. It has cheap glass in it. But keep in mind, it's $280, so it's a very budget lens. The colors coming out of this lens are very impressive. That entire B-roll sequence and all the vlog shots, they were in the standard color profile, so no complaints with the color reproduction. But if you look at this picture specifically, it's of my set. I used it for a thumbnail in last week's video. If you look at my main light, you can see some purple fringing around the ring of the light. That's due to the low quality glass in the lens. That's gonna happen with cheaper lenses. But I remember I was editing that photo and I noticed that, and I'm like, oh wow, I didn't even know this was a thing. And I looked at it it, and it was pretty prominent. Because it's purple, it's not really a natural color, so when you see something purple, it just jumps right out to your eye. Now this lens does produce some decent lens flares if you're into that. We really weren't able to test it too well because the sun wasn't directly out. It was more of a cloudy day when we were shooting, but it does do a pretty decent job. But overall, I'd say it's a fantastic image for $280 worth of lens. But what are some negatives when you're buying a lens like this? Well, first things first, it is the build quality. It's cheap, there's a lot of plastic, so in the long run, it probably won't hold up as well, but it will survive a few drops, so that's not too bad. One advantage, though, of it being all plastic, it's a very light lens, so it's not a huge burden to carry around. Another con is the actual glass in the lens. As I said before, it's not the most expensive lens, it's not really the sharpest, and the glass in there isn't really that high quality, but it does the job just fine. And also, that small aperture makes it extremely hard to get decent low light footage. I mean, what I would recommend is trying to look into another lens that has a faster aperture, look into getting brighter lights, but this is definitely not a low light lens by any means. And finally, if you're someone who uses manual focus for video, you're gonna hate that focusing ring. It's so small, there's like no travel at all. But as I said, autofocus nowadays is extremely good, so you really don't need to be using manual focus anyway. I will link the lens down below if you want to pick one up, and I'll also link the more expensive 10-22 counterpart. But I will see you guys in the next video. Make sure to like and subscribe if you are new. Peace out.